The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp wood, exhaust fumes, and something else I couldn't quite place, maybe old incense, maybe mildew, maybe something deeper and fouler that had seeped into the very foundations of this part of the city. It was well past midnight. The neon glow from distant Shinjuku was muted here, filtered through rain-streaked windows and narrow alleyways that seemed to swallow light. I pulled my collar tighter, though the chill wasn't entirely from the temperature. It was the kind of chill that starts in your gut and spreads, the kind that tells you you're somewhere you absolutely shouldn't be. My job rarely took me to places like this anymore. The discreet offices, the quiet arrangements, the clean disappearances, that was the ideal. But sometimes, loose ends needed snipping, or forgotten remnants retrieved. This was one of those times. A client, a woman who had needed to vanish quickly to escape a situation she refused to elaborate on, had left behind a small, crucial item in her old apartment. She was gone now, hopefully already on a bullet train south, a ghost in the digital age. My task was simple: retrieve the item, ensure nothing pointed back to her or, more importantly, to us. The address led me to an apartment building that looked less like housing and more like a structure that had decided to simply give up and lean against its neighbors for support. It was old, older than most things in this ever-rebuilding city. The concrete facade was stained and cracked, windows were dark and, in some cases, boarded up. A single, flickering fluorescent light in the entryway hummed a dying song, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe just outside my peripheral vision. I checked the number again. 3rd floor, Unit 3B. The key I had been given felt cold and heavy in my gloved hand. Inside, the hallway was worse. The air was stagnant, carrying that same unidentifiable, unsettling smell. The linoleum floor was scuffed and peeling, and the walls were painted a depressing, institutional gray that did nothing to lift the oppressive atmosphere. Each step I took seemed to echo louder than it should, the sound swallowed by the dead air before it had a chance to dissipate. The elevator was predictably out of order, a rusted metal cage promising nothing but trouble. I took the stairs. They groaned under my weight, each creak a complaint from the ancient structure. The silence on the upper floors was profound, broken only by my own breathing and the distant, mournful cry of a police siren somewhere far away. It felt wrong. In a city of millions, there should be some sound, some sign of life, even at this hour. But this building felt empty, hollowed out. Unit 3B was at the end of the hallway. The door was a heavy, dark wood, scarred and scratched. As I inserted the key, the tumblers turned with a grinding protest, as if the lock itself was reluctant to let me in. The door swung inward with a slow, deliberate creak. A different kind of air met me inside. It was warmer than the hallway, stuffier, and the smell was stronger here. It wasn't just old and damp, it had a cloying sweetness beneath the decay, like rotting flowers or spoiled fruit. I stepped inside, carefully closing the door behind me. I slipped off my shoes, a deeply ingrained habit even in a place like this. The floorboards felt cool and slightly sticky beneath my socks. I pulled a small, powerful flashlight from my jacket pocket and switched it on. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a small Genken area, then panning into a room that seemed to rearrange itself in the shifting light. It was a typical small Japanese apartment layout, Genken leading to a main room, likely with a kitchen area tucked away and a separate bathroom. But everything was off. The furniture was sparse, draped in old sheets as if the occupant had intended to move but never did. Dust lay thick on every surface, yet certain areas looked strangely clean, as if something had been recently dragged across them. On one wall, an old calendar was stuck open to a month from years ago. Next to it, a child's drawing was tacked up, depicting a family with stick figures but with faces that were smudged out into disturbing blurs. My eyes caught on something else. Arranged neatly in a corner, almost hidden behind a draped armchair, were several small, dark objects. As I shone the light closer, I saw they were traditional omamori charms, usually bought at shrines for luck or protection. But these looked worn, almost brittle, and they were tied with black ribbon instead of the usual red or white. They felt less like blessings and more like wards. A faint sound reached me. A scuttling. In the walls? Above me? I froze, listening. It stopped. My heart hammered against my ribs. Just an old building, settling, I told myself. Or maybe rats. But the feeling persisted. The feeling that I was not alone. That something in this stagnant air, in the oppressive silence, was watching me. The light from my flashlight seemed too weak, unable to push back the heavy shadows that clung to the corners of the room. The space felt larger than it should have, the walls seeming to recede into the darkness, blurring the edges of the room. I took a tentative step further in, the floorboard protesting under my weight. The silence rushed back in, deeper now, more absolute. The air felt colder on the back of my neck. The sweet, decaying smell seemed to intensify, making me feel slightly nauseous. I had a job to do, a simple retrieval. But every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to turn around, to run back down those groaning stairs, out into the less than safe but infinitely preferable city night, and never look back. Something was deeply wrong in apartment 3B. And I was trapped inside with it. The faint, unsettling whisper seemed to coil around him like unseen smoke, foreign syllables indistinguishable from the wind rustling through the tall grass but somehow distinct, deliberate. Liam stood frozen, the small wooden effigy heavy and strangely warm in his palm. It was crudely carved, depicting a figure that might have been human, or perhaps something else entirely. Its limbs were elongated, its head disproportionately large, and where eyes should have been, there were only twin depressions that seemed to drink the dim light. The wood felt old, smoothed by countless touches, imbued with a faint, earthy scent mixed with something else he couldn't place, like stale incense and dried blood. Rational thought warred with the sudden, cold knot in his stomach. It was just a carving, probably a child's toy dropped or a discarded piece of local folk art. The whisper? Just the wind, the strange acoustics of this valley. His mind, tired from the long journey and the humid heat, was playing tricks. Yet, the feeling persisted, the prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the undeniable sense of being watched from the edge of the dense, emerald jungle that pressed in on the small cluster of houses. He glanced around. The village was eerily quiet. The usual sounds, distant chatter, the clang of metal, the crowing of a rooster, were absent. The houses, built on stilts with thatched roofs, seemed to hunker down under the oppressive afternoon sun. The air hung thick and still, heavy with the scent of damp earth, blooming jasmine, and something else, something metallic, like old pennies. Not a soul was in sight. It was as if the village itself held its breath. Retreating quickly, Liam stepped back inside the small, simple house he was renting. The door creaked shut behind him, the sound loud in the silence. He leaned against it for a moment, the effigy still clutched in his hand. The cool, dim interior offered little solace. Shadows clung to the corners, deep and impenetrable. The air inside felt heavier than outside, trapping the heat and the unsettling silence. He walked over to the worn wooden table in the center of the room and placed the effigy on its surface. Under the weak light filtering through the single window, the carving looked even more disturbing. The lack of eyes was particularly unnerving. It stared sightlessly ahead, yet Liam couldn't shake the feeling that it saw him, knew he was there. He needed to understand this. Pulling out the small backpack he'd brought inside, he rummaged for the few books on local culture and folklore he'd packed. His reason for coming to this remote corner had been to escape, to write, to immerse himself in a different way of life. He hadn't expected this. Flipping through the pages, his fingers sticky in the humidity, he searched for images or descriptions that matched the effigy. There were references to ancestor spirits, to guardian spirits of the home and village, Fai-Baan, and to more malevolent entities, things that lurked in the shadows and the jungle's depths. Figures used in rituals, offerings, protective charms. Nothing exactly like this. He remembered the warnings from the driver who had dropped him off, a nervous man who spoke halting English. "Be careful, Sahib. The old ways here, they are strong. Do not disrespect the spirits. Do not disturb the forgotten." Liam had dismissed it as local superstition, colorful stories for the gullible foreigner. Now, the memory sent a fresh wave of unease through him. Had he somehow already disrespected something? Disturbed the forgotten? He looked at the effigy again. It sat perfectly still, yet its presence seemed to fill the small room, radiating a palpable sense of something. Not just wood and paint, but something charged, significant. Was it a warning? A boundary marker? Or was it meant for him specifically? A faint scratching sound came from the roof, directly above him. Mice? Geckos? The old house was full of small creatures. But it sounded too deliberate, like tiny fingernails scraping wood. He held his breath, listening. The scratching stopped. The silence returned, thick and heavy. He moved to the window, peering out through the dusty pane. The single dirt path that served as the village's main street was still deserted. The jungle wall seemed closer now, a solid, dark green presence that swallowed the light. He thought he saw movement at the edge of the trees, a flicker of shadow that didn't match the swaying leaves. He strained his eyes, but it was gone. Just then, the old woman who owned the house, Mei Lin, shuffled out of her nearby dwelling. She was frail, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes dark and ancient. She didn't look at him directly, but her gaze seemed to settle on his house, specifically on the window where he stood. There was no smile, no nod of greeting. Her expression was unreadable, perhaps a mixture of pity and fear. As she slowly made her way past his gate, she paused, her eyes still fixed on the house. She raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a slow, deliberate gesture, pointing towards the effigy on the table inside before continuing on her way without a word. A chill that had nothing to do with the heat snaked down Liam's spine. She had seen it. Known it was there. And her gesture, it wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement. As if the effigy wasn't just an object, but a message. A message she understood, and one that filled her with dread. He turned back into the room, his heart pounding. The effigy sat motionless, but in his mind, it seemed to have shifted slightly, its featureless face now angled towards him. The air felt colder around it. And then, so soft it was almost imagined, he heard it again. The whisper. Closer this time, right outside the window, a sibilant hiss of foreign, ancient syllables, accompanied by the faintest, most disturbing sound of something dragging itself across the rough wood of the outer wall. The air in the cramped space beyond the loose panel was stagnant, thick with dust and the unnerving, coppery sweet smell. Alex's flashlight beam trembled as their hand shook. It wasn't just the cold that was unnatural, it was a penetrating chill that felt like it reached into bone marrow, colder than any draft could explain. The silence here wasn't the silence of abandonment, it was a profound, heavy quiet that felt less like an absence of sound and more like something actively suppressing it. The small wooden box on the stone platform was the focal point. It was dark wood, aged but seemingly intact, covered in carvings that were both intricate and disturbing. Alex leaned closer, the beam steadying slightly through sheer willpower. The patterns weren't decorative flowers or simple geometric shapes. They were twisting, flowing lines that resolved into distorted figures, perhaps human, perhaps something else, their limbs unnaturally elongated, their faces contorted in expressions that could be agony or ecstasy, or a terrifying blend of both. The style wasn't immediately familiar, certainly not like the serene Buddhist imagery Alex had seen elsewhere in the region. This felt older, more primal. Around the platform, the dark stains weren't just splotches, they formed a rough circle, thicker near the base of the platform and thinning out towards the dusty edges of the small room. They were dark, almost black, with a faint reddish-brown tinge visible under the direct light. Dried blood was the only explanation Alex could think of, and the thought curdled their stomach. The smell intensified as they got closer, thick and sickly, layered with something earthy and damp, like overturned soil mixed with decay. This place felt forgotten, yet deliberate. The hidden panel, the carefully placed platform, the box, the stains, it wasn't random storage or simple neglect. It was hidden, secreted away, like a potent secret or a dangerous prison. Alex's mind raced, trying to connect this to anything they knew or had heard since arriving. Old legends, cautionary tales about specific areas, the hushed reverence with which locals sometimes spoke of certain mountains or forests. There were whispers of things best left undisturbed, of debts owed to the land or the spirits that inhabited it. Was this connected? Was this an offering? Or worse, a form of containment? A faint sound broke the heavy silence. It was a soft scraping, barely audible, coming from the wall just behind the platform. Alex froze, every nerve ending screaming caution. They swept the flashlight beam across the crumbling plaster and ancient wood of the wall. Nothing visible. Just dust and shadows. But the sound came again, a tiny scritch, like claws on stone, or something dragging itself slowly across a rough surface. It was relentless, quiet, and utterly unnerving in the oppressive stillness. The feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just the vague unease of being in a hidden, creepy place. It felt specific, focused. Like eyes on the back of their neck. Alex slowly turned, scanning the small room's corners, the low ceiling festooned with ancient cobwebs. The shadows seemed deeper than they should be, clinging to the walls despite the bright beam of the flashlight. They seemed to writhe at the edges of their vision, fleeting movements that vanished the moment Alex looked directly at them. The air grew colder still, the unnatural chill now accompanied by a prickling sensation on the skin, like static electricity building before a storm. The metallic sweet smell became almost overwhelming, making Alex feel lightheaded. Their breath hitched in their throat. There was something profoundly wrong here, something that went beyond decay and abandonment. Then, the box on the platform seemed to shift. It was subtle, maybe just an illusion caused by Alex's shaking hand or the flickering edge of the flashlight beam. But it looked like the lid lifted by the barest fraction of an inch, just enough to reveal a sliver of absolute, lightless black beneath. There was no sound, no creak of old wood. Just that infinitesimal, silent movement. Alex instinctively recoiled, stumbling back a step, their heart hammering against their ribs like a trapped bird. The scraping sound behind the platform stopped abruptly. The silence that returned was different from before, it felt expectant, hungry. And then, a new sound emanated from the room. Not from the wall, not from outside, but from the very air around the platform and the box. It was a low, guttural hum, more felt than heard, a vibration that resonated deep within Alex's chest. It grew in intensity, a resonant thrumming that filled the small space, accompanied by a pressure that felt like hands pressing in on Alex's eardrums. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen further, coalescing into indistinct shapes that remained just beyond the reach of the light. Panic flared, sharp and undeniable. This wasn't a place to explore or investigate. It was a place to flee from. Alex scrambled backwards towards the opening they had created, their eyes locked on the platform and the vibrating box. The carved figures on its surface seemed to writhe now in the pulsating light of the beam. As Alex reached the gap in the wall, their hand fumbling for the edge of the loose panel, the air behind them solidified. The low hum intensified into a roar that felt like it was tearing through their very being. The cold became unbearable, an icy hand clamped around their heart. And from the impenetrable darkness beneath the slightly raised lid of the wooden box, something wet and black slid into view. He felt a cold, skeletal hand close around his ankle. Alex's breath hitched, a sharp, involuntary gasp tearing from his throat. Every muscle in his leg seized, jerking violently away from the impossibly frigid touch. The hand held firm for a second, bone-dry and chilling, before his desperate pull succeeded, freeing him with a sickening wrench. He scrambled backward on the dusty tatami floor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His free hand fumbled in his pocket for his phone, fingers clumsy with panic. He pulled it out, the screen a sudden blinding rectangle in the oppressive gloom of the storage room. His thumb swiped frantically to activate the flashlight app. The beam cut through the thick, particulate-laden air, a wavering shaft of light. He aimed it low, under the raised wooden floorboards where he'd been reaching for the old lacquered box. Darkness. Only darkness met the light, the space beneath the floorboards a cavernous void filled with generations of dust and shadow. There was no hand, no arm, nothing visible. He shone the light back and forth, his hand trembling so badly the beam danced wildly across the rough-hewn wood and cobwebs. The cold was still there though, a lingering icy burn on his skin where the hand had been, seeping up from the floorboards, not just local but spreading, filling the small room with an unnatural chill that bit through his thin jacket. He pushed himself further back until his shoulders hit the rough plaster wall, pulling his knees up to his chest, his gaze fixed on the gap under the floor. It had been real. Not a draft, not imagination, not a cramp. A hand. A skeletal hand from the darkness beneath the house. He had heard the whispers from the few old villagers who still spoke to him, fragmented tales about this place, the Yamazaki house. Stories of what lay beneath the living level, the earth pressing up, memories clinging like damp rot. They spoke of Yami, the deep dark, and things that lingered where the veil between worlds thinned. He had dismissed it as local superstition, the fanciful fears of the isolated elderly. Not anymore. A sound. A distinct creak from the floor above him. It wasn't the groan of settling wood or the wind whistling through a gap. It was slow, deliberate. Like a careful footstep. Then another. And another, moving across the ceiling directly above the room he was in. Alex froze, listening. His breath was coming in ragged gasps, loud in the suffocating silence that had fallen after his initial cry. The footsteps stopped. Silence descended again, thick and heavy, pressing in on him. He held his breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding in his ears. Then came the whispers. Low, sibilant, not quite language. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the very air around him. Not loud enough to make out words, but the sound was unmistakable, a chorus of faint, dry rustling sounds like dead leaves skittering across stone, or perhaps brittle, ancient paper unfolding. They seemed to swirl around him, sometimes closer, sometimes receding slightly, malevolent and utterly alien. He didn't understand Japanese well enough to catch spoken words even if they were clear, but these weren't human sounds. They were like the whispers you might imagine coming from something that hadn't breathed in centuries. He had to get out of this room. He had to get out of this house. Slowly, keeping the phone light pointed at the gap under the floor, Alex began to shuffle sideways along the wall towards the door. Every tiny movement seemed to amplify the whispers, making them sharpen, coalesce. He could feel their attention on him, a palpable weight. The cold intensified, raising gooseflesh on his arms and the back of his neck. The air grew thin, heavy with the smell of old dust and something else, something metallic and earthy, like freshly turned grave soil mixed with rust. His hand, still shaking, finally reached the sliding door panel. The wood felt cold and rough under his fingers. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, dreading what might be on the other side, dreading leaving the relative security of the wall at his back. But staying felt like waiting to be consumed by the darkness under the floor or the whispers in the walls. He took a shallow breath, steeling himself. Just as his fingers gripped the edge of the panel to slide it open, the footsteps above him started again, quicker this time, scurrying. And the whispers around him surged, growing louder, clearer, focusing into something that sounded like frantic, dry chattering right beside his ear. At the same instant, from the long, dim hallway outside the room, came a sudden, violent slam. Not a door closing normally, but like something heavy had been hurled against a wooden panel with tremendous force, the sound echoing through the old structure, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. The sound was closer than the footsteps or the whispers, right outside, demanding attention, demanding terror. The lid of the small wooden box groaned open, a sound like an ancient sigh in the otherwise quiet room. Sarah held her breath, peering into the dim interior. The air seemed to grow heavier, colder, the faint scent of dust and old wood giving way to something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood mixed with incense. Inside lay not jewels or papers, but a collection of small, intricately carved figures. There were perhaps half a dozen of them, nestled on a bed of brittle, yellowed silk. She reached a trembling hand in, picking up the nearest one. It was about the length of her thumb, fashioned from dark, aged wood that felt oddly warm to the touch. The carving depicted a human form, but distorted, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The face was a rictus of terror, the tiny mouth open in a silent scream, the eyes wide and staring. It was disturbingly lifelike, despite its miniature size and the rough nature of the wood. She picked up another. This one showed two figures intertwined, one kneeling, the other standing over it, its hand raised as if to strike. The detail was horrifyingly specific, capturing fear and malicious intent in wood. Each figure she examined elicited a deeper wave of unease. There was a figure with a head too large for its body, its face contorted in agony. Another showed a figure seemingly consumed by vines or tendrils, its features obscured by writhing wooden coils. The final one was perhaps the worst, a small, hunched form, faceless, but radiating a profound sense of despair. These were not decorative netsuke. They were representations of suffering, perhaps offerings, perhaps something far more sinister. They felt heavy in her hand, not just in weight but in their oppressive atmosphere. They seemed to drink the light from the room, casting small, misshapen shadows on the silk. Beneath the figures, she saw something else. A roll of brittle, yellowed paper, tied with a thin, faded ribbon. It was a scroll, or a very old letter. She carefully lifted the figures out, placing them gingerly on the tatami mat beside the box, feeling a strange reluctance to even touch them. They seemed to watch her with their carved, hollow eyes. She picked up the paper. It was covered in Japanese characters, written in a script she did not recognize, not the blocky kanji she sometimes saw, nor the flowing hiragana. This was older, more stylized, like brushstrokes from a different era. She could not read a single word, which only amplified her sense of isolation and dread. What terrible story did this paper tell? What dark purpose did these figures serve? As she held the scroll, a sudden gust of wind rattled the shoji screen door violently, making her jump. Outside, the forest that pressed in on the ryokan seemed to sigh and groan, a deep, mournful sound. The old wooden structure of the inn itself creaked in response, settling with noises that sounded uncannily like footsteps in the hallway outside her room. She froze, listening. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, thick with anticipation. She felt utterly exposed, as if opening that box had peeled back a protective layer, revealing her presence to something that had been waiting, hidden in the shadows of the old inn and the dense woods. She glanced back at the figures on the mat. Had their positions shifted slightly? Or was it just her mind playing tricks in the fading light? The small, screaming face of the first figure she'd touched seemed somehow more vivid, its silent cry echoing in the sudden stillness. A floorboard creaked in the hallway just outside her door. It was a slow, deliberate sound, not like the random settling of an old building. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She held her breath, straining to hear over the frantic pounding in her ears. The sound came again, closer this time, just outside her door. It stopped. She waited, every muscle tensed, gripping the unreadable scroll like a lifeline. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. She slowly turned her head towards the door, her eyes fixed on the delicate paper panels, half expecting a shadow to appear on the other side, or a hand to slide them open. Nothing happened. Yet, the feeling of being watched intensified, a prickling sensation on her skin, a cold knot forming in her stomach. It wasn't just the figures or the scroll anymore. It was the room, the entire ryokan, the night closing in around it. It felt like the very air was alive with a malevolent presence, roused by the opening of that hidden box. She needed to put them back. Quickly. The thought was urgent, primal. She fumbled with the scroll, trying to roll it back up with shaking hands. It resisted, its brittle surface threatening to crack. The figures on the mat seemed to pulse with a faint, invisible energy. Another creak sounded, further down the hall this time, followed by a soft thud. It sounded like something heavy being moved, or perhaps dropped. The sounds were too distinct, too deliberate, to be just the wind or the old building. Someone, or something, was out there. And it knew she had the box. It knew she had opened it. The creepy atmosphere she had felt since arriving at this secluded place in rural Japan, a quaintness that had initially felt charming, now felt suffocating. The smiles of the elderly owners, which had seemed polite, now felt like masks hiding something ancient and secretive. The deep woods surrounding the ryokan, beautiful and serene by day, now felt like a cage, holding something dark within their depths. She had to get rid of the box, or hide it again. She scooped up the figures clumsily, feeling their unnatural warmth against her skin. As she placed the last one back into the box, just before closing the lid, she thought she saw a flicker of movement in the carved eye of the screaming figure, a brief, horrifying hint of life. She slammed the lid shut, the latch falling back into place with a soft click that echoed too loudly in the charged silence of the room. The metallic, sweet smell seemed to dissipate slightly, replaced by the scent of old wood, but the oppressive feeling lingered, heavy and cold. She held the box tightly, unsure what to do next, the unreadable scroll still clutched in her other hand. The noises in the hall had stopped, but the silence now felt like a predator holding its breath, waiting. She was alone in a foreign place, with a box of horrors and a scroll she couldn't read, and the distinct, terrifying certainty that opening that box had just invited something unspeakable into her life. The guttural whisper, harsh and low like stones grinding together, came from directly behind her. Sarah froze, flashlight beams still spearing down into the newly revealed darkness beneath the loose floorboards. The air in the elder's small, cluttered room, already thick with the scent of stale incense and damp wood, suddenly felt heavy, pressing in. She hadn't heard anyone approach. Not over the drumming in her own ears from adrenaline and fear. Slowly, agonizingly, she turned. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The small, wizened figure of Ongbei, the village elder, stood just a few feet away. His face, usually a roadmap of weathered smiles and quiet authority, was unreadable in the dim light filtering from the single bare bulb hanging precariously overhead. But his eyes, usually twinkling with a mixture of ancient wisdom and gentle amusement towards the strange foreigner, were flat, devoid of warmth. Beside him, two other men, their faces equally impassive, stood like silent sentinels. They were men she recognized from the village, farmers mostly, their hands gnarled from years of working the paddies. Their presence felt less like a casual visit and more like an ambush. The whisper came again, a low rumble in the elder's throat this time, and she caught a few fragmented words she understood, words she had learned painstakingly during her time here, Dui Du, Kong Fai Cho Ko. Below there, not for you. Her grip tightened on the flashlight. The beam wavered slightly. The opening she had found was just wide enough for a person to slip through, leading down into an inky blackness that seemed to swallow the light whole, leaving only a faint, dusty haze where the beam met the void. A cold, musty air, thick with the smell of earth and something else, something stagnant and unpleasant, drifted up from the hole. It smelled like decay, but different from the decay of leaves on the jungle floor. This was deeper, older, somehow more profound. Ongbei? Her voice was thin, reedy, barely a whisper itself against the sudden, heavy silence of the room. Outside, the usual night sounds of the village, distant chatter, the occasional bark of a dog, the drone of insects, seemed muted, pushed away by the tension in this small space. The elder didn't reply verbally. Instead, he took a slow step forward. The other two men shifted, subtly blocking her easiest path to the door. It was clear she wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not with the hole exposed. Her mind raced. What was down there? She had been researching local folklore, the strange superstitions surrounding the patch of ancient forest bordering the village, the hushed tales of things that walked at night. She had dismissed most of it as charmingly spooky legend, the kind of stories remote communities told to keep their children from wandering too far. But the intensity on the villagers' faces now, the palpable fear mixed with something that looked like grim determination, told her this was no mere story. The whispers started again, not just from Ongbei now, but from the other two men as well, a low, overlapping murmur in Vietnamese she couldn't fully decipher. It wasn't aggressive, not exactly, but it was insistent, a wave of sound that seemed to press her towards the dark opening. It felt like they were chanting, a low drone that vibrated in her bones. She caught words like ma, rung sao, nuoi shua, spirits, deep forest, old people. It was the language of the folklore she had been studying, now twisted into something menacing, something real. The cold air from the tunnel grew stronger, carrying with it that strange, foul odor. It felt like a breath, exhaled from the earth itself. Her flashlight beam, steady despite her trembling hand, showed nothing but sheer blackness. No steps, no visible floor, just an infinite drop into the unknown. Yet, the whispers seemed to emanate from there, from the hole itself, joining the voices of the men in the room. Or were the men only amplifying what was coming from below? Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. She wasn't just a researcher anymore, she was a trespasser who had stumbled upon a secret they clearly protected fiercely. And the secret wasn't just a hidden room, it was whatever lay waiting in the darkness below. She took a step back, bumping into a small wooden chest. The men didn't physically block her, but their presence, their silent, unyielding gaze, was more effective than any barrier. Ongbei raised a hand, not threateningly, but with a gesture that felt heavy with centuries of tradition and warning. His lips moved, forming words she barely heard over the rising crescendo of whispers, a sound that was starting to coalesce into something almost musical, a low, mournful hum. Di Suang, he said, his voice raspy. Go down. The hum from the hole intensified. It wasn't just cold air now, it felt like a subtle pull, a magnetic force tugging at her very core, urging her towards the precipice. The whispers grew clearer, overlapping, no longer just words but a cacophony of faint, distant voices, like a crowd murmuring just out of earshot, their words promising things she couldn't grasp but felt deep within her soul were terrible. She looked from the impassive faces of the men to the terrifying mouth of the tunnel. There was no escape. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. Her hand, slick with sweat, tightened on the flashlight. She could feel the weight of their expectations, the pressure of the whispers, the inexorable pull from the darkness below. There was nothing else to do. With a shuddering breath that did nothing to calm her racing heart, Sarah took a step towards the edge of the hole, her flashlight still aimed into the impenetrable black. The whispers seemed to welcome her, growing louder, swirling around her like a shroud as she knelt by the opening. The cold, foul breath of the tunnel washed over her face.